Welcome to the project. Right now, there are growing fears the tide could be turning against Ukraine in its war with Russia. The country desperately needs more weapons. Top of that list is tanks. In what should be good news, Australia's got loads of old tanks that we don't want. So why aren't we donating them? Outmatched, outgunned, outfunded, Ukraine is being worn down.
Putin is losing, but Ukraine is also losing. No one is winning from this conflict.
Wavering support in the West compounding Ukraine's suffering. The conflict, a war of attrition that's playing into Russia's hands. The hope?
If we can get enough Western kit to the Ukrainians in time, then they should prevail.
But a new parliamentary report has found Australia is falling short. That there is, quote, a pronounced need for greater urgency in processing Ukraine's direct requests for aid. And for months, Ukraine has been making requests for 59 retired Aussie M1 Abrams, long hailed as the world's best battle tank.
The scale of the war that we are facing is enormous. And we're not asking for Australian troops on the ground, but we are asking for the military equipment which Australia no longer needs.
20 years old, the Abrams never saw combat and were decommissioned in July, replaced by 75 new ones. But in February, the government said that gifting the tanks was not on the agenda. Then, despite Ukraine's desperation, last week the government still refused to commit.
We are definitely looking at all the material that we have. There is some platforms that work and some that frankly will not work in Ukraine.
But these tanks are already working. This, one of 31 Abrams tanks donated by the US to Ukraine last year, used to equip the elite 47th Brigade. More than half of the American M1 Abrams have since been destroyed, disabled or captured. But if Australia handed over ours, Ukraine could restore the 47th Brigade back to its original strength, with enough left over to equip a second unit.
It's only the tank that can afford you that unique combination of firepower, mobility and protection. Both sides will be desperately trying to get as many as they can.
So, as Ukraine runs out of tanks and our Abrams sit gathering dust, if Australia can give more, why aren't we?
This war is the most consequential war in the world. We can end this war, and the only way to do it is to make sure that Ukrainian military is strong and Ukrainian military has the tools to fight and has the tools to protect itself.
We are live from the lands of the Kulin Nation, and joining us is Liberal Senator David Fawcett, who served in the military for 22 years. He's also the Deputy Chair of the Parliamentary Committee that has called on the government to donate these tanks. Senator, this kind of seems like a no-brainer. We don't want these tanks. Ukraine is desperately in need of them, so why don't we just donate them?
That's a really good question, and it's one we put to Defence during the recent inquiry that the Senate held, and at the time they could give us no good reason, but as you said in your intro, the US has donated a number of their M1 Abrams, and so there's no reason from a third-party perspective that we couldn't donate them either directly or via the US.
Half of those that the US has donated, though, are no longer working because of the attacks. One of the arguments seems to be that these sort of tanks are vulnerable to drone attacks, and that's specifically how they're being taken out in Ukraine. Is there an argument here that these are actually not appropriate tanks for that war?
Well, what we've seen in Ukraine is that they have adapted pretty quickly to the drone warfare, and so a lot of the vehicles that they're now driving have wire cages or protection above them to protect them from drones. So, yes, tanks and other vehicles have been taken out, but they need something to start with, and we have these that are now excess to our requirements, and we should be sending them.
Senator, this seems like a very tortured argument. I mean, we're talking tanks, but let's also talk about those Taipan helicopters, which the government chose to cut up and bury instead of donating to Ukraine. They said that they were not right for purpose, not fit for purpose. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. Fundamentally, the arguments that Defence put forward just don't stack up when we look at things like New Zealand and their very successful operation of the same type of helicopter. The Ukrainians are best placed to decide what it is that they wish to use. And having just been here in New York for the General Assembly, nations right across the world, including our region, are talking about just how important it is that Russia does not prevail in this conflict, because that will give heart to nations in our region that are already starting to assume that might is right and use their coercive powers against nations such as the Philippines, threats against South Korea and threats against Taiwan. And any conflict in our region would have a devastating effect on Australia's economy as well as security for our neighbours.
Did we really bury them?
Unfortunately, that is what has happened. They were stripped of parts, and I know a number have been taken off base for burial, and the last I saw there were a number in a hangar in Townsville, but they had been largely stripped of parts.
Senator, you've served with the ADF. You've got some pretty good insight into how all this works. Why do you think Australia is dragging its feet on donating this kind of military kit?
Well, I think there are two things that come into it. One is that Defence logically wants to make sure that we are not running ourselves short. But the other part is that in the early days, the governments gave additional funding. So the Morrison government gave $70 million of new funding. Since then, almost all of the funding has been what we call absorbed by Defence. So every time something is committed, essentially it's coming out of the Defence budget. And I think there's a concern there that any of this equipment, if it has to be repaired, modified or supported, that's just going to be more money coming out of the Defence budget. And the Senate report, which has just been handed down, has called on the government to make sure that when they donate, and they should donate as a default, equipment that we don't need, that if there are things taken from ADF stocks, then that should be replaced with new equipment.
Senator, I was going to say thanks for your time. We should point out that time is something stupid in the morning in New York. So thank you very much for staying up for us.
Yeah.
And go to bed.
Or go out.
Indeed, 4:30, New York, the city that never sleeps.
Yeah, well,
Obviously,
not.
clearly.
Thank you very much for your time.